When we look around, it can look like we are surrounded by death, destruction, and wickedness. That no matter where we turn or where we look, we see nothing but darkness. It is easy to see the enemy at work, causing the world to be divided, communities and neighborhoods broken, families ripped apart, fatherhood being belittled and dismissed, and motherhood comes second to career. Only doing what is right for you is exalted. When we look around, we can see nothing but a graveyard full of dead things, a landscape that you would believe is too far gone, too far lost, worth giving up on. But God is at work, and we have a God that can bring order from chaos. A God that can use a book to change hearts. A God that can take 12 and make millions. A God that can take 2 and make a nation. A God that can use fire to bring forth life. A God that can bring hope to a world that asks, where is God?
Where is God? My name's Ron. I am glad to be here this morning. I get to be and serve as your campus pastor here in Greene. And we get to ask that question again this morning as we look through the story of Esther. I want to welcome those who are joining us online. We are so glad you're with us this morning and excited to continue in this series. I think this question must have been ringing in the ears of Esther. You think of some of the things that's gone on in her life at this point. This question, where is God? She was an immigrant, an orphan immigrant, raised by her cousin Mordecai, an outcast people group, the Jews, in a foreign land. As a beautiful young woman, she was taken from her home. She was forced to be a part of the king's beauty contest for his pleasure, and imprisoned, in a sense, in the castle, in the king's palace. She lost her freedom. She lost her hope of love, lost the hope of a family, lost the hope of a future. And what did she win? She won a drunken party animal who made rash decisions, who loved to show off his power, who had the habit of trading in his wives when he was ready for a new model. Esther did become queen, but she was a trophy and a pawn of the king. It must have seemed like to her, where is God? Mordecai, her cousin who had raised her, gave her the advice, hide your heritage. Hide your heritage. Don't tell people you are a Jew. And she did. And she followed her rule flawlessly. She was one who pleased the king. She stood as queen, as the figure for the empire, and she quietly maintained her Jewish faith. It must have seemed like her life was a mess. It was just a bunch of knots and loose ends and untied things that she couldn't figure out. Why is what's happening? Where is God in all of this? And in the middle of all this, Esther learns that her people have been given a death sentence. The king just signed the death warrant to the Jewish people. And her family, her people, were going to be executed. Less than a year away at this point, executed. Time was ticking. And her nationality would be wiped out. And Mordecai comes to her, and he steps up to her, and he says, speak up for your people. And think about Esther at that point. She says, and I'm paraphrasing, she says, what can I do? I'm powerless. I'm just a figurehead. I'm just a trophy wife with no real power. What can I do? I've been married for 5 years at this point. And I haven't even seen the king in a month. He's not interested in me. Our fire has kind of waned. And after all, he looks for new models. I'm on borrowed time. What can I do? Xerxes hasn't asked for me, and if I go in before him to talk to him, without him calling, it's a certain death sentence for me. Remember the law. Remember Vashti. What can I do? She must have been thinking, what a mess. What a mess. Where is God? Have you ever felt like your life was a bunch of dead-end knots and loose ends? Maybe a little bit like this. The back of a tapestry with just strings going everywhere and knots in wrong places, seemingly no order, just visual disorder. I think sometimes our lives can feel like this picture. We often see the problems. We're quick to see the failures and the difficulties. We're quick to get stuck in the knot and can't see anything beyond it. Have you ever looked at the news and felt powerless to correct the darkness of our culture or fix the wild political situation that we're in? Have you ever felt like your vote was small and the problems were huge? Have you felt powerless? Maybe you've had a teacher or coach that you just can't get a break with. It just doesn't seem to be working out. Maybe you've put a lot into a certain subject. You've just invested so much time and study, and it just doesn't seem to click. You're just not making it. You just can't make the cut. Maybe you have an unfair boss or coworkers that just don't seem to understand you, or maybe feel like they're working against you even. Perhaps a relationship that is broken, and you've done everything you can possibly think to do, and you just can't fix it. We often live in a mess. And we see the knots, we see the loose strings, we see the problems. We feel powerless and sometimes hopeless. So what did Esther do? I think Esther must have been thinking, our fate is hopeless, and yet Mordecai's words keep ringing in her ears too. What if? Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? What if you're exactly the person at exactly the time that God has right where you're at, right for what's going on right now in your life, your family's life, your community's life, your nation's life? What if you're exactly the person that's there for such a time as this? And that's ringing in Esther's ear too. See, what if God was already there? Always there? What if Esther was one of his fingerprints? She could have hid. She was powerless after all. She could have just been quiet. What does she do? Let's take a look at that. If you join me in Esther chapter 5, and we're going to be on page 411 in the chair Bible. If you don't have a Bible, or you have a friend that doesn't have a Bible, we'd love you to take the Bible as our gift. You'll find one right in your row, and I'm going to be in several chapters of the book of Esther today. We're going to start in chapter 5. So if you join me there. What did Esther do in the face of insurmountable odds? She asked Mordecai and all the Jews in the capital city to fast with her for 3 days. I think her first reaction was, I can't do this. And her second reaction is, okay, let's fast. And that was connected with prayer. Let's go to God. She says, I'll go. And if I must die, then I must die. That's faith. We're about to run into some twists and turns in the next couple chapters. So as we mount this roller coaster, just go ahead and buckle up and let's dive in. Verse 1, on the third day of the feast, Esther put on her royal robes and she entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. See, Esther didn't stay quiet. She embraced her place as queen. And not as most desirable female in the empire. That wasn't what she embraced. She embraced the place of queen of an empire. She puts on the royal robes. She enters the court, her husband's place. She's wading into deep waters. This isn't her realm. But she steps up and she walks in. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. And what do we know about that law? He didn't ask her to come in there. If he just stays still, she dies. Execution on the spot. If he raises out the scepter, she lives. The tension, I think, mounts. Verse 2, when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her. He held out the gold scepter. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Whew. The first danger's out of the way, right? He allows her to come in. And rather than immediate execution, he welcomes her. His heart melts. He sees his girl and he says, come. Esther, I think, is embracing the message of Isaiah the prophet just not many years earlier. And he says, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Speaking for God. God is with you. He says, don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. And so Esther can take that step in, and I think she believes that God is with her. She can take the step of faith, and God helped her. Verse 3, then the king asked her, what do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I'll give it to you. Even if it's up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you. What an offer. How many of us have given our wives that offer? You laugh because all of our kingdom is theirs, right? That's exactly right. But that wasn't Esther's place. She was the trophy. She had nothing but what the king gave her in the palace. And he says, I'm going to give you, just ask. And yes, this is hyperbolic. He wouldn't have given her half the kingdom. This was a saying that they threw out. But I believe he is saying, I'm in a good mood. Try me. Give it a try. So now must be for such a time, right? Go ahead and ask. Ask. Now's the time. The king is ready. He's happy. Give it a try. Verse 4. And Esther replied, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come to a banquet that I have prepared for the king. What? That wasn't the request. Was it? That wasn't what she was supposed to say. She's in a foreboding situation. She's waded into deep waters, and I think she gets a little bit of cold feet. She's trying to figure out what to do, and she doesn't have it all figured out. And as she steps in, she says, I need a little more time. Come to a banquet. Come to a banquet. Let me make you happy. We know the king likes banquets. Come, then I'll ask. And so there's lots of food. The wine is flowing. The king is enjoying himself. Haman is there. They're having this great big banquet. Verse 6, the king says again, Now tell me what you really want. You didn't want me to come to just a banquet. Tell me what you really want. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half of my kingdom. Now must be again. Isn't this such a time? Isn't this the time? But what does Esther say? Please come with Haman tomorrow. Let's do this all over again. I'm not quite ready yet. Please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet that I'll prepare for you. Then I will explain. And I'm thinking as I read it and I think through this story, what if Esther waits too long? This is getting more treacherous here. What if Haman figures it out? What if all this plan fails? Esther's hesitating. Her people are in peril. But this Jewish woman with no power is starting to call the shots for the two most powerful men in the most powerful kingdom of the world. She has now conquered their schedule for the last 2 days. And Xerxes, he senses something is up. Like there's got to be more here, but he doesn't know what it is. And he hasn't figured it out. He's receiving special attention from his wife, and I think he's enjoying that. The only problem is he's got to keep bringing Haman along. It's messing up the situation. Okay, I'll come again. I'll got to bring Haman. Check out what happens. Verse 9. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously, Haman became furious. He became furious. It's really easy to injure this guy's ego. We saw his rise to power last week as we looked at that. He is angry if someone does not give him the honor that he thinks he deserves. However, verse 10, he restrained himself and he went home. I think that's an attempt at humility, but look at what happens next. Verse 10, Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh his wife, and he boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children, and he bragged about the honors that the king had given to him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and all the other officials. Wow, look at me. Look at what I've done. Look at what I have. Look at how great I am. Then Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king to a banquet that she prepared for us. And she invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. I got to come to the banquet today, and she likes me. I'm her favorite official. And the king, yeah, he's there too. Haman's on top of the world, isn't he? He is on top of the world. He's got the wealth. He's got the power. The queen likes him. Verse 13. Then he added, but all this is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, just sitting there at the palace gate. It's worth nothing. Like, look at all of this. Oh, but it's worthless. This guy he's got all the power. And yet, an insignificant man who works on the low end of the palace officials, who already has a Jewish death sentence, sets him off, pushes him too far. Verse 14, so Haman's wife Zeresh and all of his friends suggested this. They say, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall. Don't make it so obvious. He says, in the morning, ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. You hate this guy so much, make everybody else know how much you hate him. 75 feet in the air. Let's make this very clear. When this is done, you can go merrily on your way to the banquet with the king. Enjoy it. And of course, this pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole to be set up. Haman's plan of genocide is running smoothly, He's about to do away with his nemesis, who, by the way, has no power, but he's his nemesis. All is good. He gets to go to another banquet with the king. He gets to enjoy the queen's blessings. For the Jews and Mordecai, almost all is lost. Mordecai's about to be killed. The Jews are about to be executed. Everything is over. Everything's just knots and loose ends. It's all a mess. How is this all going to work out? But we have chapter 6. Let's turn over to chapter 6, verse 1. That night, the king had trouble sleeping. On this night of all nights, the king has insomnia. He just happened to have trouble sleeping. What luck for them. But it gets better. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign, his favorite book, his favorite bedtime story, so it could be read to him. Of course, it's a book about himself, all the great things he's done. And verse 2, in those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door of the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. If you remember that back a couple chapters, Mordecai had saved the king. And the history book just happened to open up to that page that night when the king just happened not to sleep. Mordecai's story, that's the one that turned up. And Xerxes is concerned. Hey, this guy saved me. He saved the king's life. Verse 3, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is in the outer court? The king inquired. I kind of picture at this point, the king asked the question and the attendants are kind of standing there twiddling their thumbs trying to figure out, we don't know. And they go scurry around trying to figure out, did we ever do anything? Nothing was ever done, king. And he starts to think, we gotta fix this, and we gotta fix it now. There must be some reason I was up all night. It must be to fix this problem. And so who's in the outer court? What official is there that I can have to help me out to fix this injustice? Because of course this king was always concerned about injustice, but this night he was. And as it happened, verse 4, as it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court. Haman was there, of course. Why was Haman there? To ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he had prepared. Well, the king has been reading about the honor that Mordecai never received. Coincidences are mounting up. Verse 5, so the attendants replied to the king, Haman is in the outer court. The king says, bring him in. So did all of this just happen? Talk about luck on St. Paddy's Day. Everything just falls into place. King can't sleep. The king reads about Mordecai. Haman shows up. He's ready to take Mordecai down. Everything just keeps piling up. Verse 6, in the middle of all those knots and loose ends, God is at work. God is at work. So as Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? And I love this. Look at what Haman thinks. Whom would the king wish to honor more than me? Like, of course, he must be talking about me. There's nobody else in this kingdom that would ever deserve any honor. Check out what he tells the king. So he replies, verse 7, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden. one with a royal emblem on his head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." See, Haman wants to look and be treated like what? The king. That's what Haman wants to be treated like. If the king understood what Haman was thinking, that would be treason. But King Xerxes has misplaced trust in Haman. Look what he says next, because you might guess what it is, but Haman has no clue. Do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew. Mordecai? Mordecai? Can you picture it? Can you picture that? Haman, the most noble official that the king has in his office right then. You go and you find Mordecai, bring him out, take my robes here, dress him in my robes, put him on my war horse, and lead him through the town square. See, this is what the king does to those he wants to truly honor. And Mordecai gets to do that all the way through town. All right, Haman gets to do that for Mordecai. What a reversal, a turnaround. What's in Haman's mind? I'm going to put this guy Mordecai up on a 75-foot pole. That's my morning. That's on my planner for today. And then I'm merely going to go to the feast. And now I get to drag this guy, honor this guy through the streets of Susa, yelling to everyone that this is the man the king honors. How humiliating. How humiliating. Haman goes home. And check out what happens at home. He talks to his wife, and he's probably just beside himself, torn up after what has just happened. Verse 13, this is what Zeresh says to him. Since Mordecai is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. Wait a second. Why didn't you give me that tidbit of advice yesterday? Like, why did you wait till now to tell me that one? While they're still talking, the king's eunuchs arrive to quickly take Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. He doesn't even have time to think. He doesn't have time to come up with another plan. What do I do next? None of that. Whisk him away to the feast. See, Esther at this point, she has lost her family as a child. She was adopted by her cousin. And then she lost him, along with her hopes and her dreams. She's forced to perform in a beauty contest for the king's pleasure. She became a queen without power. She has a deadbeat husband who signed the death sentence of her entire nationality. What a mess. In a way, it looks like this. It looks like that, the tapestry with all the loose ends, with all the knots. And yet, with all the visual disorder, when you turn it around, it looks like this. A beautiful flower. What is God doing? She probably sees the knots. She sees the loose ends. But God is starting to turn it around. And God has a beautiful plan for Esther. He has a way to work in the middle of the pain and the mess and the trouble and bring beauty out of the ashes. To bring the flower out of the fire. He brings the tapestry that he's been weaving all along through every loose end and every knot. And so we often get stuck in the knots, and we get focused on the dead end loose strings. And all the time, we miss the beauty that God is stitching out of our mess. For Esther, a lot has happened in just 2 days. Esther was a powerless pawn and trophy. But a lack of power is not a problem for God. The king hadn't even been interested in her for the last month, and now he is into her, and she is orchestrating his schedule, and he has just offered her his kingdom, half his kingdom, 2 times, twice. And at the same time, Mordecai, a man who was condemned to death and the object of a murderous plot, had just been treated like the king himself. Things are starting to flip. Things are starting to turn around. Years later, Paul, who was a Jesus follower, gives a little insight into how God works. He says, God chose the world. God chose the things. My mind wants to switch those words. So I'm going to retrace. 1 Corinthians 1:27, Paul said this: God chose things that the world considers foolish, and he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. You can get an insight into how God works. Not the way we would think. Maybe not the plan that we would put into place. It's not how we would tie the strings up. But God can take things that are powerless to shame things that are weak. You see, our weakness is God's opportunity. God's opportunity. He can take things that we think are failures and he can make them successes. His fingerprints were all over this roller coaster, the ups and the downs, the twists and the turns. God was involved in all of that behind the scenes because God empowers the powerless. And he can turn anything around. Check out what happens as God starts to turn over his tapestry for Esther. Take a look at chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 2. Second banquet starts. The wine is flowing. The food is plentiful. The king is enjoying himself. And so in verse 2, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom." Wow. 3 times now, right? 3 times he has offered this request. Tell me what you want. It's going to be really hard to turn her down at this point because you've offered it 3 times. God divinely worked in the background. Verse 3, Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the queen or the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had been merely sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. If it was just slaves, I could have lived with that. But they're going to wipe us out. Can't you give us our life?" "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" And Esther replied, "This wicked Haman, our adversary, our enemy. He's the one." And Haman goes, "Oh." She didn't like me. Haman grew pale, I think. He's fearful. Haman a day ago was secure in his power, and he's now reduced to begging for his life. And he does so, and as he tries to beg for his life, he falls forward onto the queen. And the king walks back into the room, and he finds Haman on top of the queen. And the king exclaimed, verse 8, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" Obviously, Haman wasn't going to assault the queen. This was a big misunderstanding, but it's a pretty good excuse for the king to get upset. He's already angry at Haman. He needs an excuse. And as soon as the king spoke, his attendant covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. The king's men know what's going on here at this point. Haman realizes it's all over. The king's servant shows up to announce at this point. If you look down in the further verse, the king's servant shows up to announce the completion of his impaling pole for Mordecai. And Haman in his mind, if I could picture it, I think that detail could have waited. Why right now? I don't even get a chance to plead for my life. And Xerxes yells out, "Impale Haman on it." What a turnaround. Haman's vengeance turns into his own demise. Mordecai is elevated and spared. Esther has a chance to plead for her people. So just a couple days before all seemed hopeless, Esther and Mordecai were powerless, but their weakness was God's opportunity. Check out verse 1 of chapter 8. On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. Mordecai now has the power of the king. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. What a turnaround. What a change. But what about the rest of the Jews? So Esther and Mordecai, they've had their fortunes have turned around completely, but the Jews still have a death sentence. And you're just going to have to wait on that till next week. Well, God isn't mentioned in this book. I can't help but see his divine fingerprints all the way through. If you start to see this, it's not the luck of the Irish. God is working all the way through. God has been working behind the scenes, using knots and loose ends to weave a beautiful tapestry. He's got the picture all planned out. And when we find ourselves powerless in our circumstances, we can be confident that God has power that we need. The writer of Psalms said this: "Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust him, and he will help you." Psalms 37:5. Trust in God. He's the one with the power. He has the power that could overturn nations and kingdoms and empires. And he has the power exactly what we need in our life for each step we take. Just like Esther, we can take steps of faith. She took that big step to walk in to the king's throne room. And we can take steps of faith too. Maybe it's a step in the growth process. Maybe it's to get involved in a connect group. Maybe it's to mentor someone, but it can also be and often is stepping up and living our faith in the world around us. Maybe right now in this wild political season. Maybe it's stepping up in our own mindset to trust that God has a bigger plan in play, even though we can't see how anything that's happening can fit toward good. But to be able to trust that God's got it in his hand. God's got this. Maybe it's trusting that God is still in control. Maybe you find yourself a minority in your school and workplace. You're going to have opportunities there to share God's love and God's message and your faith in ways that people that aren't there will never have. Maybe you're a parent and you need courage to set boundaries and to parent well in a culture that has no limits. It takes a step of faith. Maybe you're drowning financially and your step is to take responsibility and make some really tough decisions. Maybe stick with a budget, cut some things out, but to honor God and step forward in faith. Maybe it's to take a step of faith in a culture that wants you to believe lies and repeat the lies and act like everything is all good. And you have the chance to stand and speak truth. We have a chance to take a step of faith. So step out in faith. Live your faith one step at a time because God is with you. You're not doing it alone. He's with you. Who's with Esther? He's with us. He's on our side. He's for us. And when you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, remember that God is in the tunnel with you. And He's got it all planned out. He's got it all figured out. And you are still in His hands, and He is still in control. He's in the business of weaving dead ends and loose strings and knots into a beautiful tapestry, and He is doing that in your life. He could take the darkest colored thread woven into the fabric of history, the unjust death of the only perfect person who ever lived, and God could take that thread and use that thread to accomplish His salvation. And He is right here with you. See, when we trust God's plan and when we take a step in faith, when we're confident in God, we don't get lost or hopeless in us. We can have courage and we can step forward when we step in His plan. We actually get to be a part of His transformation. I think we get a chance to bring kindness and love to our schools and our workplaces, to our communities and to our neighbors. We get a chance to speak up and share the gospel, the message, the salvation of Jesus to the people around us. And we may just see hopelessness traded in for faith. And God is weaving the messes and the brokenness into something good. And He has us here for such a time as this. If you take a moment with me and just think about some of the things that we've looked at in the book of Esther all the way through. In a few moments, we're going to sing together. And I'd just like to read a few lines of the song that we're going to sing. The song says, "How great a chasm lay between us. How high the mountain that I could not climb. And in desperation, I turned to heaven." You see, that's the biggest mess. That's the one that matters the most, is us separated from God. But Jesus conquered that. All we need to do is trust in Him. All we need is to place our faith in Him. And when we do, when we turn to heaven, when we speak your name into the night, then through the darkness, your loving kindness tore through the shadows of my soul. Because the work is finished. The end is written. Jesus Christ, my living hope. if we find ourselves hopeless, Jesus has conquered death. Our hope can be in him. That song will continue to a chorus, and it says, hallelujah. Praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah. Death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you that you are with us no matter what we face, no matter what difficulty we might be in the middle of, whether we can see a light at the end of the tunnel or whether we just see darkness in front of us. You're there with us. You want us to trust you for our salvation. You gave us Jesus to forgive us, to break our chains, to give us freedom. God, if there's anyone here that has not accepted that message, may they start there today. Trust you as their Savior. To just speak to you and say, God, I want your forgiveness. I know that you love me and you have a future for me. My trust is in you. And God, as we end up in those knots, as we get stuck with frayed edges and not knowing what the future holds, help us to trust that you have our future in your hand. No matter how that future turns out, that you have us in your hand. At the end of the day, we know you win. Help us live like it. Help us take a step each day in faith, living our faith, living your love, loving you and loving the people around us, knowing that you are with us. In Jesus' name.